Harkening back to bygone days when friends and neighbors sat around the Cracker Barrel, but we don't have Cracker Barrels here today, so we've got this nice long table to share a story or two. From the Glacier Age to the Information Age and into the next millennium, the fascinating stories we're going to tell you will give you a brief glimpse of the people and the events that molded our village. The men and women sitting at this table are celebrating our village's heritage by creating an ambitious project to honor Northbrook's 100th birthday on November 18, 2001. They've been researching and writing chapters for the hardcover book, Northbrook, Illinois, The Fabric of Our History. The book is being written as a joint project between the Northbrook Centennial 2001 Committee and the Northbrook Historical Society. An anthology of village history is being created by a very diverse group of individuals. And like the beautiful dainty quilt that's hanging back here that graces the cover, each of the authors brings to the project different backgrounds, writing styles, and experiences. Some are published authors, and others have put pen to paper for the very first time. What they do share is a love of the history, a love of our village, and a love of its history. And like the blocks of the quilt, they've woven together a historically accurate and readable book that places Northbrook's village history in context to the world and into the Northbrook of today. English journalist, essayist, novel, and poet G.K. Chesterton said, "The disadvantage of men not knowing the past is they do not know the present. History is a hill or a high point of vantage from which alone men can see the town in which they live or the age in which they are living." From our vantage point, we've each chosen a short story to share with you about the fascinating history of our village. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Charles Sengstock, who will begin with Glacier's Bounty.
Thank you. Well, the Glacier's Bounty tells a fascinating story, not so much as how it was written, but the story itself, about how the present landforms in our area were shaped by huge glaciers that passed through this area, and about the early human settlers. The chapter closes at the year 1833, which is the Chicago Treaty. I'd like to read just a few excerpts from the chapter for you right now. This is about the glacier. About 13,000 years ago, a huge glacier, one of a series of ice sheets that cover much of northern Illinois and the upper Midwest, began melting and receding slowly to the northeast. Up to 2 miles thick at its middle, the huge frigid mass moved slowly about 1/3 of a mile per year. The enormous weight of the glacier ground, compressed, and scoured the earth beneath it, in some cases down to bedrock, carrying away traces of previous glaciers that had earlier moved over the same area. As the ice mass melted, it released tens of thousands of tons of glacial till, a mixture of rocks, fragments, gravel, soil, and organic debris over the Chicago area landscape. Massive amounts of water flowed from the melting glacier, which further rearranged the glacial till deposits over the area and cut through troughs in these deposits, forming rivers and streams. Water collected in deep depressions hollowed out by the glacier, making lakes big and small, fertile farmland to subsurface riches such as sand, gravel, and clay deposits. Now, moving on to the second major theme in the chapter, the early human settlements. The earliest settlers probably came into the area 10,000 years ago, most likely following the glacier, the melting glacier, as which I mentioned moved very slowly, but provided a rich environment for a lot of wild game, as big as mastodons and mammoths, and as small, of course, as the rodents that are still with us. The earliest group was called Paleo-Indians, and as I mentioned, they were here about 10,000 years ago. It was succeeded by many other civilizations. The most highly developed was the Mississippian culture, which lived between 915 AD, 1500 AD. They were able to develop large villages, highly developed social order, craftsmanship, tools. They traded extensively and so forth. And I'll just read one paragraph from the section coming up closer to history. Explorers Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette passed along the west border of present-day Illinois in 1673 during their southward journey along the Mississippi River. They were exploring the region for the French government in Canada. Friendly Indians along the Mississippi told them of a shortcut for their return, which took them along the Illinois River, followed by a short portage to the Chicago River and on to Lake Michigan. Once they reached Lake Michigan, where Chicago now stands, they paddled up the shoreline on their way to Montreal by way of Green Bay. This shortcut saved several days and many miles. The Indians that Marquette and Joliet ran into down around Kaskaskia on the Illinois River were the Illini Indians, which were the largest settlement of that type in the 17th century. I could go on, but I will relinquish my time here to authors Barbara and Charles Schultz, who pick up at the year 1833 for the second chapter, which is called Carving a Community from the Prairie.
Our chapter covers the time from the Indian Treaty in 1833 to the time that the railroad came through in about 1871. And as I was doing the research, one of the things that fascinated me and just kind of boggled me is the hardships that the people were willing to go through to come here and settle and make their new homes. I don't have my school teacher voice. Some of the people like Peter and Magdalena Hintz, they were a young couple. It started out probably as a great adventure to come to this new land. But after 30 days or more on the sailing ship coming over here, and then traveling by wagon with several other families from Pennsylvania, getting to Chicago, then coming on northward, they got as far as the Northfield area, and the women finally said, enough. This is where we're going to stop. This is where we will settle. And they did, and then of course it still took a while to clear the land and build their home and get settled. And another person that showed this same energy and perseverance was John Bach. He walked out here with his brother from New York. They were looking for a place to settle. They looked around. They liked the area here. His great-grandson told me about his great-grandfather sitting on a rock next to the river and looking around and deciding, this is where I want to settle. But it was winter time, so he couldn't go back and make other arrangements. He made a dugout home for himself among the roots of trees near the corner of Waukegan and Dundee Road, where Sports Preserve now. He spent the winter there, then walked back to New York, found a young lady who was willing to come back with him. They were married. Now, I don't know if they walked back, but came back, and of course, John Bach was a very successful farmer. He got himself a land patent and many more acres of land. And the Hints, the Bachs, Werhanes, many of these families did very well when they came here. But it was a struggle just to get here, much less build their homes when they got here. And I think that's one of the things that struck me as so interesting as I was reaching these families. And Chuck and I have worked together on this, and he took some different parts of the chapter.
Yeah, actually, I have some different perspectives. I'm finishing reading a book called The Sorrow in Our Heart, The Life of Tecumseh, by a well-known author, Alan Eckert. And one of the quotes in this book Eckert writes of pretended chiefs of the Potawatomis who also are in the habit of selling land that did not belong to them. And I got to thinking, who did we buy this land from?
The Potawatomis. Who were all the other tribes here? Who really owned it? They cleaned up on that deal. First real estate agents in the area. One of the things, since we're both educators, I thought I would mention something about education. The early education in the area was essentially in quote-unquote private schools. They were in homes or in outbuildings of the different people that lived in town. The state of Illinois did not pass legislation for tax-supported schools until 1855, and we had schools going before that time. First schools were in homes and shops, and in 1841, the first school building was built on what is now Sanders Road, south of Winkleman Road. And it's said to be the first school building built north of Fort Dearborn at that time. It remained a one-room school until the 1940s. It is the predecessor or forerunner of Winkleman School District 31. The other thing on education, I thought, since my whole life has been in education, the average number of total days in the education of a child in a child's lifetime. Now we're talking about the child's lifetime. The number of days of education they had was about 208 days. Their total education lifespan. That was in the 1840s. Today, one school year is 180 days, and there's people that like to lengthen that. Basic curriculum covered reading, writing, and arithmetic. Books were primarily provided by the teachers and sometimes by the parents. An outstanding example of children getting this kind of education, Dr. John Kennicott, who was the first doctor in this area. And he formed what we know the Grove where he was. Reportedly had only 30 days of formal primary education before he went on to earn a degree at Harvard in medicine. I think obviously somewhere along the line he probably had some private tutoring, or he came from a home where there was a lot of books and he was encouraged to read. But his formal education in the primary and elementary, the primary schools was 30 days. With that, I'll slide this on to Judy Hughes, who's working on Civil War, township, village names, forest reserves, and pulling a whole bunch of things together.
Not only does the book have been divided into chapters, but there's some sections called sidebars, and I've written some of the sidebars. And I'd like to take just a moment to introduce Dan Kay, who's sitting here in the front row, who's also an author of some of the sidebars. Not with us today is Joe Smith, who's doing a sidebar, and Mona Lewis, who's been an invaluable resource to all of us sitting here at the table. I have written 4 sidebars. One of them on the civil township is what I'm going to read to you today. The poll list shows 174 eligible voters. That was only men, of course, at that time. Attended the very first Northfield Township meeting on the 2nd of April in 1850. This is an astonishing number of people who came out to vote that first year, because the 1850 census shows that there were only 175 households in all of Northfield Township. So almost everyone was here because they felt this was so important. From among their peers, they elected a township supervisor, a town clerk, an assessor, and a tax collector. They also elected 2 constables, 2 justices of the peace, 3 highway commissioners, and a poor master whose job it was to provide assistance for the township meeting. Following their election, the officers signed an oath of office, declaring that they would faithfully execute their duties. Some of the oaths of office went on to explain a little bit about what their duties were. However, the remainder of the oath, signed by every single one of the officers, harkens back to a time, gives us a glimpse of a time we read about only in novels and certainly never think about here on the Illinois prairie. The Civil War section has been very, very interesting, learning a little bit about some of these families that had come here early on, some of the German settlers who'd gone off and willingly went off to fight for their new country. We had 2 gentlemen here in Northfield Township in 1850s, Charles Fritz and Daniel York, who were assigned to the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry, which was a unit raised here in Illinois. And they were among 178 men who enrolled from or were credited to Northfield Township. There were 5 fatalities among our men, 5 confirmed fatalities among our men in Northfield Township. There is a Frederick Keast, who we're not quite sure. His family believes that he died at Chattanooga, but he may indeed have moved on to another state and lived the rest of his life there. It's been very interesting learning about some of these special issues and special areas. One of the other sidebars I have is a walk through the woods, talking about our forest preserve. And it talks about the first Northbrook lands that were purchased by the Forest Preserve District were located outside of our 2 square mile village. Some Woods, to the north of Dundee Road, is one of the first places when we think of Northbrook Forest Preserves. However, this forest began the 20th century looking nothing like it does now. It was farmland owned by the Werhane family, farmed for 3 generations. It contained a heavily timbered area or groves that back away from Waukegan Road, an orchard, and acres of cultivated land. The numerous arrowheads, some of which are over on the wall there, found on that farm as it was tilled, indicate that it was used as hunting grounds for the Indians. There are over 3,000 acres of forest preserves here in Northfield Township. And at one time, the land was changing hands so fast that in July 1922, the village board of Shermerville passed an ordinance outlawing the sale of any land within our village limits to the Forest Preserve District. With that, I'd like to turn my chapter, or turn it over now to Helen Nordland, who writes about East Northfield to Shermerville to Northfield.
Hello, thank you for coming. We've enjoyed this. It's been a lot of work. I will testify on behalf of my committee people here. We've been meeting for over a year, but it's been most rewarding because I've gotten to know a lot of these people who have great talents. And I was happy to write a chapter that I know a little bit more about the coming of Shermerville, but it starts back to East Northfield. When the train tracks were laid in 1873, the train stop was called Shermer Station, according to the map. But as far as we know, it was never actually called Shermer Station, except for the railroad depot. Frederick Shermer had given the land for the railroad station. And when the post office was established in the railroad station in 1885, they called it Shermerville. And of course, in 1901 then, when the area was incorporated, the town officially became Shermerville. The arrival of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad was a welcome stop. And it was also very well received by Shermerville, as the railroad provided transportation of dairy products, bricks, and passengers into the city. And following the Chicago fire of 1871, bricks were needed to rebuild the city. And at that time, rich clay deposits had been discovered in several areas of Northfield Township, creating a new industry for the farming community. The railroad often provided amusement for the children of the community. They didn't have the movie theaters and VCRs and Game Boy and all the things that our children know today. Jean Bohannon, whose father was the village blacksmith, told me many years ago that she and her best friend, Esther Bucher, used to go and watch the cattle being herded into the cattle cars. I mean, that was kind of their fun thing to do because there was not much else in the way of amusement. Sometimes Grandpa Hipsley, the gate tender at the Shermer Road Railroad crossing, would let the girls climb the steep stairs to his two-story shack where the girls could watch the trains and look out all over Shermerville. Now that's one picture we haven't come across, and I'm hoping somebody somewhere might have a picture of that railroad crossing with the shack up above 2 flights of stairs. And while businesses flourished in the downtown area of Shermerville, agriculture continued to be the foremost occupation. And the John Warehane family operated the Wayside Farm on Waukegan Road from 1905 until 1987. And who will ever forget the distinctive red barns where fresh corn and eggs were sold, along with zinnias from the garden. Louis Warehane remembers well the beginning of the sweet corn business. Louis Oberock, who had the farm where Phil Johnson's restaurant stood for many years at Lake Hook and Waukegan Roads, and Louis's mother, Frida, decided to sell corn to passing motorists. Now, Louis's father, John, thought this was kind of a joke until the vegetable stand grossed $7 for the first day. And the Wayside Farm stand was in the business. Now, Louis, this was what, about 1919, 1920? $7 was big bucks then. Farming has never been easy, as reported by Louis and Olive, who have said for almost 17 years they never left the farm together. When their son John was 16 and old enough to get a driver's license, Louis and Olive made a trip to Brownsville, Texas in 1956, where they had last vacation before John was born in 1940. Milton Hans, maybe some of you remember the Hans family, he wrote about a strange thing that happened following a rain, crayfish, which emerged from the prairies. And he wrote, "In the years when I used to drive cows to pasture in the summer, I would be barefoot most of the time because skin grew back free on the bottom of my feet, while shoe soles cost money. After warm, heavy rains, the ground would be covered with crabs, which made walking very hard. And there were crabs, and they were called chimney crayfish. Despite the demands of the farm, families took time for religion. There were no established churches in the downtown area until the 1880s, when the citizens formed the Hope Union Church, which later became the Village Presbyterian Church. Then in 1898, the priests and brothers of the Society of the Divine Word arrived to establish the mission press and a training school for orphan boys, which eventually led to the formation of St. Norbert Parish. St. Peter Church on Shermer Road expanded and joined the Evangelical Synod of North America in 1912. Following incorporation in 1901, businesses began to flourish in downtown Shermerville. Sidewalks and streets were paved, a volunteer fire department was established, postal facilities and phone service were expanded. Then along came the horseless carriages, which provided better transportation and opened new areas of recreation. And although the residents did work hard farming, brick making, tending shop, keeping house, they did take time for bicycle riding, croquet, ice skating, swimming in the water holes, and family picnics. And it was the lure of those beautiful picnic groves in Shermerville and a ready supply of alcoholic beverages that caused the weekend disturbances, which eventually led to the name change from Shermerville to Northbrook in 1923. Don?
Well, in respect to our president, Les Happ, here's a little article about Peter Happ. He saw the grocery business change from bulk flour, sugar, salt, crackers, cracker barrel contents, and cookies in barrels, to packaged and refrigerated goods, much like we have today. In the early days, many products were purchased from local farmers, such as butter, milk, poultry, eggs, and veal calves. Happ had a butcher shop. In the early days, butchering was done out back, and the chickens were dressed in the basement. If you wanted to order something from Haps by phone, you asked the operator for number 1. It doesn't seem that we were about to run out of numbers in those days. Here's one. On the 7th day of July, 1933, the village board adopted a resolution specifying that it shall be unlawful for any person, firm, or corporation to sell or deliver unwrapped bread or other bakery products to be used for human consumption within the corporate limits of the village. Violations of this ordinance were subject to a fine of not less than $2 nor more than $25. This ordinance still wouldn't fly in France today. You see them riding with a bare loaf of bread on the back of a bicycle. In January 1925, the village board approved an estimate of the cost of deepening and widening the channel of the north branch of the Chicago River, where it passed through Northbrook. The total estimate was $4,450. 74 years later, it seems to me we were talking in the $1.3 to $5 million range. Talk about inflation. Here's one that was surprising to me. The North Shore Airport Company purchased 130 acres of prairie and began to build an airport. Northbrook land was considered rather swampy along the creek, particularly along the three forks of the Chicago's River's North Branch. This land just west of the West Fork was no exception. It had to be drained before substantial runways for an airport could be built. This entailed the installation of approximately 13 miles of drain tile. 11,110 feet of tile ranging in size from 4 to 20 inch in diameter was laid in November and December of 1928. And in May and June of 1929, an additional 53,460 feet of 4-inch and 6-inch tile were laid to complete the job. The airport was named Sky Harbor. I wonder how many times the Public Works Department has run into this tile as they were developing the area out there. Now, we had a hardware store right next to the railroad tracks up here. It was called Rugen's Store, and the manager, Dick Appleyard, employed Fingerless Joe to unload bulk materials such as sand, gravel, and coal from gondola cars. Joe normally resided in the Sherman House Hotel on the east side of Shermer Road, where the commuter parking lot is now located. He earned his nickname due to the fact that he allegedly had a habit of frequenting one of the many taverns after each payday. On one of these occasions, on a cold winter's night, he didn't find his way back to the hotel, and he slept in a boxcar. He froze the fingers on both hands to the extent that they had to be amputated. Although fingerless, he could handle a scoop shovel with the best of them, and he could unload 40 tons of coal or material quicker than anyone else in these parts. Now I'd like to turn it over to the author of Chapter 5, 1946 to 1963, The Transformation of Northbrook, Eileen Borner.
My chapter takes a distinct change, being the post-war period when growth sort of exploded in Northbrook and the area around. And what I write about is very much the story of the village itself, the organizations that grew up, and the manner in which people were challenged by a lot of problems and dealt with them. At the dawn of the post-war era, Northbrook was still very much a small rural town. Most businesses were located along Shermer, the one main street. Clusters of residences had been built near Shermer, Walters, and Northbrook School on Waukegan Road. And a new subdivision, the Highlands, was being built near Western. The town did not have a bank or a library and was not yet large enough to qualify for door-to-door mail delivery. Every fall, the smell of burning leaves filled the air. Nearly half of the total acreage of the village of Northbrook in 1949 lay vacant. There was much more land consumed by forest preserve than there was used for residences, and 20 of the 32 commercial acres in town were nurseries. The residents of Northbrook knew that the village would grow quickly after the war. My chapter tells the story of how they planned for this growth and how the people of Northbrook and the surrounding township it grew to include strived to keep Northbrook a pleasant place to live. And it tells the story of their enthusiastic involvement in the life of their community. A few glimmers of life in the 50s as technology was coming towards us. When the village church was given a television, it invited youngsters of the whole village to come in just to watch a TV program. And when General Douglas MacArthur spoke before Congress after being removed from command of the Army by President Truman, Northbrook High School's entire student body watched him on a single donated television placed on the stage of the high school gymnasium. Winter seemed to be much colder in those days. They would record numbers of 59 and 60 days when the ice ponds would be frozen, and skating and winter activities were very popular among all the people of Northbrook, it seemed. Children could skate down the creek to reach the ice ponds, one of which was located just behind this building, and another in the depression below the water tower. This skating rink below the water tower, at the time it was developed, was approximately 5 acres. It spread into the area which was later taken up by Cherry Lane, and was the largest ice skating rink in the Midwest. For that reason, starting in 1955, Midwest Olympic speed skating trials were held at the tower rink. Schools were let out early so the children could attend. The reputation of the race grew so that by the time the third annual race was held in 1957, there were thousands of spectators watching as 400 club speed skaters in various age groupings raced around the 8-lap speed skating track. By the end of my chapter, Northbrook was recognizable as the town we know today. The population had swelled between 1950 and 1960 by 247%, between 1945 and 63 over 300% growth. Many churches and schools were being built. Northbrook had 2 shopping centers and a central business district, and many new industries and a district park. Just a glimpse of what people devoted to building this community. I think that's what most impressed me was in reading of all the volunteer activities and contributions and the endless numbers of times people went to the polls to vote on issues involving schools and referendums. And, the time when it was apparent that we needed to improve municipal services, for example, the Cherry Lane underpass and new sewers and lights for town and new streets, the residents of Northbrook were asked to vote on a bond issue that was nearly $1 million to cover all of that. The budget for the village at that time per year was around $500,000. So the commitment put into building this community, I was really impressed with the discovery. By the time we come to the end of this period, Northbrook is very recognizable as the village we know today. It could no longer be described as the village, just a village of homes. As the year 1963 came to a close, one after another, the farms in Northfield Township were sold and their goods auctioned off. Along the edges of the forest preserves, where fox hunts had once taken place, the rumbling sound of tollway traffic had replaced the trumpeting of bugles and the baying of hounds. I'd like next to introduce Paul Giannetto and Paula Siebert, who cover the years 1963 to 1989.
Thank you. It was difficult for me to pick out anything that stood out in my mind because from 63 through 89, Northbrook had so many things that happened. The Park District grew. We had a new North Suburban YMCA built here. We made new roads, widened roads, put in traffic lights, began our own water pumping from Lake Michigan. We were the first offshore town that had our own water. And businesses grew like Northbrook Court, and in every one of them, though, there was a lot of squabbles, some court battles. It seems we were in court all the time. And I remember talking to my wife about it and saying, why do we have to fight about everything? But the one thing that I was personally involved in the fight, and my wife also, she knew Homer Harvey, the boss of District 28, and she did some volunteer teaching at the school. And of course, one thing to make a good community is proper educational facilities. We had a neighborhood school there in Northbrook East that they talked about closing, and this battle went on about 2 years. We had a lot of meetings with the school board, with Homer Harvey, and we lost on all counts, but we had a lot of fun doing it. But after they closed our school, well, we thought we'd give it one more go, so we tried in Northbrook East to secede from Northbrook and create our own school district. So we went to court. We had garage sales and volunteered our own money and time, and also went around to companies to ask for money. But we finally lost that one too, but it was a lot of fun. And the school later, after it closed, was taken over by the Park District and used about 4 or 5 years, and then was sold at auction to a Korean Christian church, and they've rehabbed it, and it's being used for good stead today. I want to introduce my daughter, Paula Siebert. She's going to talk about the Historical Society.
I got involved in this project because of the Northbrook JCs. My sister, being president of the JCs, not being a resident of Northbrook, decided that it would be more convenient for me to attend a meeting at 7:30 in the morning than it would be for her, even though I have children and a husband to take care of. And of course, being the younger sister, I did exactly what she told me to. And this time period was very hard, is very interesting for me, but yet very hard, because I was a small child during a big portion of this time period. And you see everything quite differently through a child's eyes than you do looking back on it through an adult's eyes. So I picked the portion about the Northbrook Historical Society and how the building itself was moved. And I have the Northbrook Historical Society originally began in 1963 to preserve a timber school dating from 1843. After this endeavor, the society more or less ceased to exist. The society remained dormant until October 9th of 1973, when H.E. Dernberg and others decided to reactivate the not-for-profit organization. The purpose of the society was to collect and preserve the local heritage. At this time, Bartolome's property at Shermer and Waukegan Road was sold. A zoning change was made to allow the building of a condominium complex on this property. The Northfield Inn, located on this property, was offered by Mrs. Clarence Bartolome to the society for $1. Bartolome. I apologize. Bartolome. On the condition that it was moved from its original site. And so on. All of you guys are very well aware of the history and how it was moved. And the best experience for me was, as a child, on January 17th, was watching when my mother brought us out. Me and my sister brought us out to see the inn being moved. And I remember that, how it was moved, and it's very interesting as an adult to see how, as a child, you just think, wow, this is so interesting, a house is being moved, and why? And looking back as an adult and having children in Northbrook school systems and realizing how important the community is really what was most fascinating to me about the chapter. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana McCloskey. I wrap up the history portion of this book by covering the years 1989 to the present. So the present's going to be a little bit hard to cover, but prior to that, I've got a lot of facts that I think you'll find interesting. I'll just read my opening and a couple excerpts from my chapter. In 1989, George Bush was the President of the United States. The Cold War was over, and the Berlin Wall was about to come down. Northbrook village officials were wrapping up negotiations with the Society of the Divine Word. The remaining open space was an issue. Construction began on the new village hall, and the 911 system went into effect. It was again a time of planning for the future and looking toward the next millennium. And then I go in to cover a lot of what everybody will be very familiar with. The technique developments, the first in the world consortium achievements of our students, our new village hall, the wonderful recycling and Earth Day programs we have, our central business circus, I'll call it, where we are still debating on what to do out there. How Shermer Road got its new facelift and is much more efficient today. And of course, the library, which I'm sure we're all going to be very proud of when it's finished. Excuse me. You know, there's little things too that maybe we aren't so aware of, like our area code has changed at least twice. Our area code. We have email addresses so we can contact the village hall and the library, and we have a kiosk going up at Northbrook Court. So we have all this new technology. We have new fire stations. The police station was improved. And another little excerpt I have, I'd like to read, kind of puts another light on how much we spend these days to improve our water system. Northbrook, once the only offshore community drawing Lake Michigan water, expanded its water intake system in the early 90s. We gained this enviable cost-effective distinction in 1963 thanks to the foresight of municipal officials and staff. For almost 30 years, a sole 30-inch pipeline supplied all the necessary water for our community. At a cost of $20 million, construction began in 1992 on a second intake system with a 48-inch diameter to ensure future adequacy and prevent the zebra mussel problems which have recently clogged water intake systems in the Great Lakes. The new line followed a route beneath Turnbull Woods, Lakeshore Country Club, Glencoe Golf Course, Chicago Botanic Gardens, Eden's Expressway, and Skokie Boulevard, ending at the filtration plant at 750 Dundee Road. These measures ensure an adequate water supply for the 32,000 residents and the 35,000 people who work in Northbrook daily. I think you'll find my chapter and every chapter that we've written here very interesting. I'd like to put in a little bit of a plug for all the photographs that all of us have worked very hard to gather. One reason I'm involved in this chapter is because I moved here in 1986 and my husband's a professional photographer, and he takes a very strong interest in history, and especially local history. And he's done a lot of, we have a lot of photographs of sites in Northbrook that now are history and are gone. For instance, you will see a photograph of the Techney farm before it's gone. Obviously before it's gone. So we have something like that in there. We have pictures of the triangle, which I'm sure everybody kind of misses. We have pictures of that. And many, many photographs that people have collected from residents who've moved from here. So not only will you be delighted by what we've written, but also by what other photographs and
illustrations and other tidbits of information we have included. So Mark Damish finishes up the book with a chapter looking ahead, but I guess he couldn't make it.
The publication is promised in time for the opening of the Centennial celebration, no later than November 18th in 2000, if not before. And now all we've got to do is spread the word that the very first hardcover book of Northbrook history is available at a special $5 off pre-publication price. Each of you found one of these envelopes on your chair. Pre-publication sales are vital to the economic success of this project. The envelope will contain everything you need to purchase the book. Additional forms will be at places throughout the village, here at the Historical Society, the Village Hall, and other places. Before opening the program up to questions, Don, would you stand for just a minute? Don is the chairman of the Centennial Publications Committee, and I'd like to present to Don this certificate, which grants him the honor and the privilege of placing the very first order for the Northbrook. His check was written.
It says April 18th, 1999. This certificate grants the privilege and honor of placing the first order for Northbrook, Illinois, the fabric of our history, to Don Hintz, chairman of the Northbrook Centennial Publication Committee, signed by Judith H. Hughes, Northbrook Centennial 2001 committee chairman. Well, thank you, Judy, and just to exercise that privilege, I will now sign. And I'll let you know that I'm doing my Christmas shopping early for the year 2000, because this is for 10 copies of the book.